All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to open with the two caveats. One is that we're in webinar mode, so I cannot see your faces. So I really do appreciate when you enter any comments you have, questions as we're going through the lecture. Let's make it as interactive as we can using the webinar chat and the Q&A box. Either way, I'm monitoring both of those as I'm talking and really appreciate your comments and thoughts as they come into your heads. We have 90 minutes today. And this, of all of these regional toolkits, this is the longest because West Southwest is such a geographically special region, we split it into two so that we can provide more granular data on what's happening in both the west part of the region and the southwest part of the region. We have also layered on some supplementary information for Hawaii, which is different from the rest of the region, but part of it. And so we'll spend a little time on those slides as well. So for that reason, this will be packed with information. I may talk pretty quickly through some of the data, but I want to stress that it is all going to be available and downloadable via the Rodale Institute and the top website, organictransition.org, beginning next week, the week of December 22nd. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the incredible work you do every day to keep organic agriculture strong and growing. Um, Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the organizations that made this toolkit possible. This work was led by the Rodale Institute, funded through the USDA Transition to Organic Partnership Program, or TOP. It's strongly supported by the Organic Trade Association, who was incredibly generous with their perspectives, insights, and data. The National Organic Coalition, and each top region played a really important role in reviewing early drafts, workshopping them with us, and asking some really good questions and giving really good feedback that helped us hone in on the most useful information for the project. My name is Joe Dixon. I'm a senior associate at Wolf and Associates. Wolf and Associates developed this toolkit for the Rodale Institute. I've been working in organic agricultural systems for the past 25 years. I served as the global director of quality standards at Whole Foods Market for about 15 years, leading that company's work on standards, agricultural policy, certification programs, organic certification. And I, through that role, worked very closely with producers around the country on organic compliance, accessing retail markets, et cetera. From 2010 to 2015, I had the honor of serving on the National Organic Standards Board as the retailer representative, and I'm currently the board president at PCO, Pennsylvania Certified Organic. My work as an advisor and a consultant these days is focused on helping independent retailers, brands, certifiers, farms, and nonprofit organizations foster resilient regional food systems and flourishing organic farms, both here in the Northeast US, where I am based in Vermont, and around the country. Who and why? Why are we here? So, we created a farmer's toolkit to provide actionable insights to transitioning and established organic farmers on the national and regional organic outlook, along with guidance on working with buyers. We took a lot of complex economic data that we have access to through the OTA and through USDA. And we wanted to take that, slice it, dice it, analyze it, and really package it in a way that can help transitioning and established farmers understand the outlook and the bigger picture of organic and how it is shaping organic growth and trend lines in each part of the country. The toolkit has three major components. There's a national component that contains all of our sort of US level analysis and data. There are 8 regional toolkits that get into the details of where we see the greatest opportunities and barriers and data for each region. We split 2 of the bigger regions into subregions, which is why you see 8 here instead of 6. We split the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, and we split the West and the Southwest. We've kind of lopped off Texas and New Mexico, and we'll present those separately from the rest of the region. The final and third piece is the buyer landscape. So, as part of the project, we interviewed 23 buyers from retail chains, single unit independent retailers, schools, hospitals, and distributors, along with processors and buyers of grain to really listen to them and capture their advice and insights on how to work with them as growers in different parts of the country. We've also created a set of four-page handouts that take the most actionable information and the most useful from each of these components and format them in a leave behind printable, emailable kind of fact sheet that summarizes the work that we've done here. All of these will be available on organictransition.org along with rhodeleinstitute.org on their resource page beginning next week. So I want to dive into the national toolkit. And again, as I'm going through this, please just jump in with any questions you might have on any of the material I'm presenting today. This project was built on a simple goal to give farmers clear, actionable information about the markets that they're serving. We look at the national picture and regional variations because they are so completely intertwined and interconnected. What's happening at a national level in terms of demand, imports, trade deficits, consumer behavior, all of that shapes the opportunities on the ground in each part of the country in very different ways. At a high level, organic demand in the US continues to grow very steadily. Even as the broader food market experiences slower growth, organic is outpacing it. And that's been the case for several years now. And while every region is unique, understanding the factors behind this increase in demand helps guide decisions around crop selection, storage, processing, and investments in diversification. Breeze through a few of these filler slides. So at a high level, I'll start very high level and then start to zoom in as we get closer to the region. In 2024, the US organic market had $71.6 billion in sales. That represents 5.2% growth over the prior year. And that growth rate, which appears very stable for the next 5 years, is about twice the rate of the overall food market. This analysis from the Organic Trade Association's 2025 Organic Market Report predicts that organic will exceed $85 billion in sales by 2029, and that very healthy 4 to 5% growth level will be sustainable for several years to come. Long story short, I think, for those of us working in the sector, we know this, but it's great to see it supported by data. Organic isn't a fad. It's not a short-term trend. It's a very mature, durable market. And while growth year over year is down since 2020 during the strange years of the pandemic, it seems very stable and very positive at 4 to 5%. What makes up that $71 billion market? Produce is still the biggest category, as it has been since pretty much the beginning. But other categories, further processed products, grocery items, beverages, and very specifically animal products, make up increasingly bigger shares of the organic pie. The fastest growth that we're seeing is in animal products. Meat and poultry are up 16% in 2024, with organic beef showing growth of 36.7%, which is wild. Incredible demand for certified organic meat, which is outpacing, of course, domestic supply and leading to some supply issues with both feed and animal protein. Dairy and eggs are also showing incredible growth. As a category, dairy and eggs show 7.7% growth, but eggs are up 16% year over year. Probably a lot of the same consumer factors and desire for clean meat are leading people to higher welfare and cleaner eggs. Textiles are showing great growth. Again, this is what we're buying, and a lot of the organic textiles we're buying are imported, but we do see a fair amount of growth potential for the domestic organic cotton sector, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we dive into the Southwest. And then beverages, a lot of functional beverage growth, a lot of better for you drinks, tonics, elixirs, things with beneficial plant-based ingredients. That I think is a really big, organic is a big driver of the growth in that category as well. Jen asks, what do you attribute to the increase in organic meat products demand? I think, my next slide kind of gets into that a little bit. I think it's a combination of health benefits. I think growing awareness of grass-based systems having better omega-3 to 6 ratios. I think it's an increased focus on animal welfare for a lot of people. Some of it has to do with the rise of paleo and more carnivorous diets. And I think people following those diets are increasingly aware of the benefits of cleaner meat. I think there's a lot of factors there. In general, the factors shaping organic demand, the demand for clean ingredients. We've all been following, the increased attention on ultra-processed foods and their dangers. Consumers are avoiding bad ingredients like artificial colors, flavors, sweeteners, preservatives. Layering onto that is an increasing number of people avoiding products with pesticide residues and bad for them components. I think all of that increasing consumer awareness is really driving awareness of the benefits of organic and increased sales in a lot of categories. The gap is I can't I mispronounce gap every time I say it. The price gap is shrinking between conventional and organic. I think as supply scales and economies of scale are realized for certain commodities, the organic price comes down a bit, conventional prices are increasing, but I think scale is helping narrow that price gap in a really way. This was the first year I saw weight loss drugs come into the OTA's report. But, the thinking there is that the increased use of weight loss drugs is leading people to cleaner eating habits. If they're eating less, it's worth it to focus on the quality of that smaller amount of food that you're taking in, which is fascinating. And then to me, the most important is generational shifts. And this, I think, is the most durable and will be the most influential over the coming decade. Millennials brought a lot of increased interest in organic, especially as our generation started to have kids and buy more groceries. Gen Z blows that out of the water. More than any other generation, Gen Z cares about sustainability, authenticity, animal welfare, um, regional and local products in a bigger way than previous generations. And as that generation ages into full adulthood, buying groceries, having kids, I think the impact on organic growth is going to be even more dramatic. Switching a little bit from what we buy to what we grow. When we look at US organic production by production value, a few years old, but I think still pretty relevant. Um, Fruits, vegetables, dairy still dominate. Grains and oil seeds, even back in 2021, showed a little bit of lagging. And I think what we've learned over the last few years is that we've started to radically increase the amount of animal feed and grain that we import as a country. Those lags, I believe, represent huge opportunity. And the fact that the market is signaling that it wants more organic ingredients grown domestically. Um, a little more on the import picture here. It's hard to get exact and up-to-date numbers on what we're importing in organic form, but we know that at least $2.5 billion in organic produce were imported in 2024. We know that 300 million of that was blueberries, 223 million was tomatoes. We know feed grains since 2021 have at least tripled, feed grain imports rather, and that organic cotton textiles are almost entirely imported. As a country, we have a really strong organic market, but there are huge opportunities to produce more of the organic products we consume here in the US. The mismatch between demand and supply, again, it's not due to a lack of farmer interest or skill or will. A lot of these issues are structural and systemic. They, are really centered around insufficient processing and storage infrastructure, insufficient opportunities for aggregation, and food hubs and distributors that are helping bring farmers together and find retail markets for their products. Land access, land costs, labor costs, season length. Those are all variables that are impacting the scenario. But we think in selective and smart ways, there are ways to address a number of these barriers around the country. So to sum up the national organic picture, it's growing steadily, but it's not just growing in this linear, like straight line way. It's evolving in a really complex way. The overall market is up, but the real growth is in animal products. There's incredible new demand because of that for grains and animal protein. And we're still importing a whole big chunk of what we eat. And if we look at that really methodologically, there's some interesting findings and revelations on what we can be producing more of domestically. So I want to pause and dive more into the regional landscape. Like I mentioned, we're dividing the regional landscape into two chunks, the West and the Southwest, because, if you look at Texas and look at California, there's a lot of differences in climate, growing conditions, and the way the markets have developed. So I will pause there. If there are questions, comments, feedback, please just pop into the chat as always. And then I'm going to start, and this is also with the caveat, the West, the region anchored by California, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, like it is the foundation of U.S. organic agriculture. It has the highest organic sales of any part of the country. It's not just a part of the organic story, it's a defining player in the organic story and anchors organic ag in the U.S. in terms of acreage, sales dollars, infrastructure, and frankly, innovation. When people think about organic at scale, they're often thinking about systems that were innovated and launched in California and in the West. So I want to talk about why the West plays this central role, how it's evolving under real constraints like water and labor, and where we see the next phase of opportunity for the region. We'll cover the scale and structure of organic production in the West, how different states play different roles, which crops and systems still have healthy room to grow, and what has to change for the region to stay resilient under climate pressure. I know a lot of this is stuff you live and breathe every day and think about constantly, and I really appreciate that. So, the Western US anchors the US organic economy. California alone accounts for 1.84 million organic acres and over 14 billion in organic sales. That is completely unmatched by any other state. But the region isn't just California. It's Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Hawaii that all contribute in really unique ways to the region. Together, these states produce more than a quarter of US organic acreage and half of total national organic sales. That's wild. It's a hub for fruits, vegetables, dairy, eggs, forage, grains, pretty much everything going into the organic agricultural system has origins in the West. Across the West, all of the states in the region, there are 2.53 million certified organic acres, over 6,000 certified organic operations, and more than 15 billion in combined annual organic sales. The region supplies about 70% of organic fruits and vegetables in the US, along with a very big share of organic feed and forage that supports dairy and livestock nationwide. The West sets the pace for organic policy and production standards. Both the state government, especially in California, major founding players in organic like CCOF, really set the pace on a lot of big policy issues. OFRF is based in California. There's just so much coming out of the West that really supports organic policy nationally. California feeds national and export markets, as do the other states. Through necessity, leadership on water efficiency and regenerative practices are really well housed in the West. And the region really has infrastructure, advocacy organizations, governmental solutions to connect farmers, researchers, and policymakers in ways that the rest of the country just does not have. Here's how the region breaks down by state. It's wild. I mean, I think California is the one of the only states, if not the only, that has a seven-figure number for its acreage in this study. It's wild. Every state on this chart plays a very different role, and that diversity is a really big strength. Some of them anchor scale, others specialize in adaptation, others in innovation. They form an incredibly well-linked organic ecosystem rather than a collection of isolated markets. Four states drive organic growth in the West, and we'll talk about Hawaii separately. It's, of course, geographically an outlier, and it has its own section coming up. But California leads the nation, producing 70% of organic fruits and vegetables. Arizona plays a really important role as a winter produce hub and a center for water efficiency innovation. Nevada is showing incredible expansion and growth in hay and forage, which with incredible rangeland potential. And Utah too is scaling dairy and grain systems and showing a lot of rotational diversity in its grain and crop production systems. Where do we see opportunity? It's almost a silly question. We know where there's opportunity. There's flourishing production in virtually every organic sector in this region. Um, and the opportunities here are not necessarily around what we can grow. They're around how can we make what we grow more resilient? Where is there innovation with water efficiency, labor stability, soil health, really investing in soil health for its longevity and preservation, and maintaining productivity under increasing pressure. California systems often become the model for the rest of the country. And I think when we look at the big opportunities in California, it's really around just continuing to deepen and innovate in the areas where it's already leading. When we look at, sort of leafy green systems in Arizona, forage and hay in Nevada, grains in general, it's a similar story. Arizona is redefining winter vegetable production through like incredible irrigation adaptation, crop timing. Nevada is doing really good work expanding organic hay and forage. And of course, supporting livestock systems nationwide, we see one of the biggest opportunities. We are importing an incredible amount of the nutrition for our animal systems. And getting that production closer to where the animal production systems are is a huge priority and opportunity. In Utah, the organic sector blends livestock, grains, and regenerative practices. Organic dairy and grain systems, like we mentioned, are really expanding, supported by mixed production models, rotational diversity showing up in really interesting ways. Utah is really well positioned to strengthen its own feed self-sufficiency while really supporting other players in the region and beyond. Stepping back, the West combines really mature fruit and vegetable systems along the coast, are most mature and most established and productive. Um, Currently expanding feed and forage systems inland, which show incredible capacity to continue to grow. And shared investment across the region in water resilience and regenerative practices. Investments in cold chain infrastructure, feed processing infrastructure and facilities, and local processing could really strengthen the West's role, both regionally and nationally, um, especially as climate adaptation and innovative agriculture become increasingly important. Now, I want to talk about onshoring opportunities. This is where, I wanted to take what we know about what we're importing and kind of identify for every region where the biggest opportunities are to increase domestic production of stuff we're importing. Onshoring in the West focuses on reinforcing, I think, the middle of the system. Local and regional processing, compost and nutrient cycling infrastructure, and feed systems for animal production systems that reduce dependence on long distance transport. Reinvesting in these areas is one of the best ways to keep more value in the region, improve the resilience of the overall system, and reduce vulnerability to logistics and shipping disruptions. Where do we see general opportunities for growth? This is a little repetitive, and I will breeze through it pretty quickly. But in general, all these areas we've discussed, key targets in the West could include maintaining its leadership in fruit and vegetable production, along with dairy, while improving water efficiency, expanding feed and rotational grains in the interior states, strengthening processing capacity and storage capacity in the region, and supporting smaller and mid-scale producers who often get squeezed out in high-cost regions. Growth here is about durability and innovation again, not just increasing volume. What are the barriers and the solutions that we see? Some of these we've already discussed, but I wanted to include them here just, for the sake of the handouts and the leave behind information. Water scarcity and drought is a huge barrier. Labor availability and cost, we know, are huge limiting factors in production. Land pressure near spreading urban markets, not unique to the West, but especially pronounced in the West, especially in California. And the solution set is pretty clear. I don't think there's much new information here, but investing in water resilient production systems, focusing on fair and stable labor pathways, really fostering regional processing, composting, other systems and inputs, and policy alignment that supports long-term organic viability. So, looking ahead, as we discussed, organic sales in the US hit 71 billion in 2024, a lot of that coming from the West. And the West will, of course, remain central to that expansion, combining the scale of California and its tradition and productivity with interior state innovation and resilience. It's very clear the West is positioned to continue to lead in climate adapted fruit, vegetable, and dairy systems, expand its feed sector, drive national composting and circular economy efforts in agriculture, which are increasingly important, and strengthen both domestic and export market resilience. Again, as we all know, the West combines scale, innovation, and adaptation in a way that no other part of the country does. Hawaii supplement. I want to just jump in here and talk about, specifically Hawaii. Makes up a substantial amount of the West, is sort of, overshadowed by California, but Hawaii represents 100,000 certified organic acres. A lot of smaller operations that follow organic practices, but probably are not formally certified. 116 certified operations in the state with an annual sales of 17.5 million. And I think that figure is probably higher when you roll in folks who aren't certified that are under the threshold. Key crops are macadamias, coffee, tropical fruit, vegetables, and canoe crops like taro and breadfruit. The footprint's small in acreage, but large in impact. A lot of the agricultural tradition in Hawaii drives regenerative practice, place-based education, export value across the Pacific, and really helps promote food security in an area that is subject to really high transportation and food costs. Hawaii's tropical diversity and indigenous knowledge make it a living model for regenerative organic systems. And, I think most of the opportunities we see are focused on what the islands are doing really well. Tropical fruit, vegetables, coffee. And most importantly, more than most other regions we're talking about with this project, really grown in ways that reflect a sense of place and culture and deep respect for the ecological limits and impact of organic production. The barriers, of course, are very real. Logistics and shipping costs in and out are huge and unique to Hawaii. Limited processing infrastructure in an area with very limited and expensive land is a very complicating factor. Land access itself remains a really big challenge. Vulnerability to extreme weather, not unique to Hawaii, but a really big factor there. And certifier access. Lower population outlying areas tend to have fewer qualified inspectors and more difficult access to certification infrastructure, which remains an issue in Hawaii. We see Hawaii's organic future at the intersection of tradition and innovation with regenerative systems, tropical climate advantages, and incredible educational leadership. The state can continue shaping national and global organic models and really serve as a template and an inspiration for other, islands, constrained environments, outlying areas with huge, transportation cost issues and opportunities for increased food security. On all of these decks, you'll find a page of references for folks who, like me, are nerds who want to dive more deeply into some of the source data and information. We're also compiling information and resources for each part of the country with a little more tailored information. So those will be part of the decks that are available for download very shortly from the Rhode Island Institute and organictransition.org. Before I plow into the Southwest and move over to New Mexico and Texas, any questions or feedback so far? Anything you're feeling, just feel free to pop in the chat. Um, all right, I'm gonna pause on that one for the discussion at the end because I think it's It's one that affects sort of both subregions, and I'd love to talk about towards the end. But keep popping in those questions. I will save them and come back to all of them. All right, the Southwest, Texas and New Mexico. Part of my story that I didn't throw into my bio is, I'm a native New Englander. I'm based here in Vermont, but when I went in my early 20s to work for Whole Foods, I moved to Austin, Texas, and ended up really doubling down on Texas. I was there for 20 years. About 10 years in, my husband and I bought a farm in Bastrop County, about an hour outside of Austin, and raised a lot of vegetables along with meat and dairy goats and chickens, laying hens for decades, or not decades, a decade in this beautiful, beautiful area of Texas on an organic farm. So I have a deep personal connection to the region, its traditions, and its limitations around culture and climate. This section is a snapshot of where organic stands today in Texas and New Mexico. We'll talk about why the region is really critically important to the whole country's organic supply, how Texas and New Mexico play interconnected but different roles in the organic ecosystem, the crops with the strongest potential, and like we did in the West, barriers that need to be addressed to facilitate continued growth in the region. Um, Southwest is an emerging powerhouse for organic production. Texas ranks number one nationally in organic milk sales. Sorry, California and Wisconsin. Number four in organic crop sales. That's Texas again. New Mexico consistently ranks among the top states for organic livestock and forage production. Together, these states supply organic milk, beef, cotton. Most of our organic cotton comes from the panhandle of Texas. And the rest largely comes from California. Um, these states also provide hay and feed to national animal production systems while building domestic alternatives to imported feed and fiber at scale. Water limited conditions in Texas and New Mexico have forced innovation. Regenerative grazing, dryland cropping, drought resilient systems aren't optional. They're a matter of survival in a lot of areas of these two states. So let's ground this in numbers. Combined, Texas and New Mexico account for roughly 725,000 certified organic acres, 525 million in annual organic sales, and about 1,200 certified organic operations. Key commodities are milk, beef, cotton, some peanuts, hay, and grains. A lot of the infrastructure in these states is concentrated around dairy and feed hubs, especially in the rangeland areas of Texas, around Clovis, New Mexico. Really strong animal production system infrastructure that is continuing to grow. This whole corridor between Texas and New Mexico anchors organic dairy, supports domestic fiber security, which has a lot of growth potential, helps us reduce reliance on imported feed, and serves as a real-world test case for organic agriculture under climate and water stress. In terms of regions too, with proximity of feed production to animal production systems, Texas really has incredible things to offer. Rather than do a whole state by state chart, since we're just two states, I'm going to kind of take each one individually. Texas is the largest organic state in the South and one of the most influential nationwide. Its scale, climate diversity, and agricultural heritage, especially in livestock production, really position it as a national leader. From the high plains of West Texas to the hill country and the coastal regions, there's everything from citrus to cotton to beef to a lot of vegetable production. And it's feeding both organic and domestic, or I'm sorry, international and domestic markets. The key takeaway for Texas is this: it anchors the organic South. Texas organic milk leads the nation, driven by large pasture-based dairies and vertically integrated supply chains. Organic cotton acreage, while small, is rebounding, supported by regenerative partnerships, textile traceability initiatives, a really strong organic cotton growers cooperative in the Panhandle that's really doing incredible work aggregating cotton supply and working with processors and buyers. Feed grain and livestock coordination programs are emerging to reduce dependence on imported organic corn and soy. Um, Nearly half the organic farms in Texas are split operations, mixing organic and conventional acres, often to manage risk and diversify revenue. And then the consumer side. Texas has four of the biggest cities in the country: Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio. Their growing suburbs are really fueling demand for organic products and regional processing. This chart, or it's not a chart, it was a chart, but then I just made it a list of things about Texas. So this list shows just how influential Texas is within the Southwest. What's important isn't just acreage, it's integration. Texas has a lot of integrated infrastructure around dairy production systems, animal feed, beef industry, feed, fiber processing. It shows a lot of really interesting examples about integration infrastructurally across several sectors. Now let's talk about New Mexico a little bit. The theme here is innovation and integrity in arid land organics. Water is an even bigger issue in New Mexico than it is in Texas, where it's a huge issue. The sector's smaller in acreage, but really strong in innovation. Organic dairies in the southern and eastern plains of New Mexico support really high value milk markets, kind of contiguous with Texas. Livestock operations integrate arid rangeland management and regenerative grazing, reducing inputs and dependence on water. We're seeing some growth and increased interest in organic corn and forage crops in New Mexico to support feed autonomy and reduce imports from outside the country and outside the region. And culturally rooted farms near Albuquerque and Taos are reviving traditional organic systems and indigenous organic systems, blending heritage with modern markets and certification. New Mexico, despite its small scale organically, really punches above its weight. Its systems are lean, adapted to a really dry climate. They're deeply place-based, and they're exactly the kind of models that organic agriculture will need more of as water becomes more scarce, and organic becomes more localized. Where do we see the biggest opportunities in these two states? I think to sum it up, it's building a national engine for organic feed, livestock, and fiber. The incredible acreage in Texas makes it an incredible asset for milk, beef, cotton, and rotational crops. Milk and beef, especially because of the feed they require. Texas is uniquely situated to both produce the animals and produce the feed. I don't think the opportunity in Texas is really discovering new things to grow, although in specialty crops, there will always be evolution and new crops that take off. It's transforming its scale. Everything is bigger, and that can be leveraged into some long-term advantages by expanding processing, feed systems, and embedding regenerative practices across really large acreage. In New Mexico, I think the opportunity is more in innovation focused around its climate. Dryland cropping, forage systems that really work for the region, specialty crops that are associated with New Mexico's identity, like chilies and legumes, drought adapted corn, could allow the state to really support the broader Southwest supply chain while maintaining low input, water sensitive systems. And in New Mexico too, its dairy sector is small but critical in its function. And I think everything that's happening in New Mexico serves as a really interesting set of models and inspirations for organic success rather in more arid regions of the country. Now let's talk about onshoring. I want to take that sort of bigger um, import scenario. Sorry, I get distracted by the questions. But I want to take this sort of import scenario and kind of make it applicable to the region, like we did with the West. Some of the biggest onshoring opportunities are, of course, cotton. And again, capacity is limited. Cotton's really hard to grow, and to grow it organically without synthetic inputs makes it even harder. So, the geography is limited, but there's still a lot of upside and transitioning and transitionable cotton production in Texas, and it's already the largest producer in the U.S., and there's definitely room to grow. Animal feed is, of course, a really big opportunity in both New Mexico and Texas. Along with dry beans and grains, we're importing a lot of dry beans and grains that can be grown in parts of the Southwest. And then a lot of chile and other spices we're importing from Asia, and there's an incredible production capacity there. Not necessarily huge volume, but still substantial and significant volume in New Mexico. Some of the adjacent areas of Texas have a huge role to play in that subset of specialty crops. General opportunities for the region, just to kind of, I think I talked about all of these, but feed and forage systems, cotton and fiber, arid land focused agricultural methods, continued growth in dairy and livestock, more opportunity for grain, peanut production, other row crops in the area. Still seeing some limitations around the lack of cold storage and grain handling in some parts of the region. And like every part of the country, labor remains a really big issue, and workforce development, and the development of skilled organic labor remains a big opportunity in the region. And again, I think these are all already discussed, but the barriers and solutions we see to issues facing Texas and New Mexico, water scarcity, and the solution there is irrigation and other innovation in dryland farming. Land access for small and medium producers is still an issue around the country. Again, infrastructure gaps and climate adaptation. That is something I experienced as a farmer in Texas, even in our 10 years. The quality of our grassland changed due to just changing temperatures and decreasing rain. So organic sales in the US, of course, at 72 billion in 2024. The Southwest is a really important part of that. And that advantage is largely focused on animal-based systems, continued growth in fiber, dryland innovation, and scaling of acreage. There's a lot of land in these two states, and it has a really big role to play in onshoring crops that we need and supporting the national organic sector. All right, I'm going to pause there and look through the questions. Somehow we're at an hour and 15, no, we're at 45 minutes. We've done this really efficiently, but there's more to cover, but I'll be focused with it. So working backwards with Kate's question, on organic cotton, um, the fiber to fabric is a really long supply chain. In the US, I'm not aware of much. A lot of what we grow is being processed locally. There are organic gins and facilities in the panhandle of Texas. And I think some of that is going to mills and other users in the US, but some of it is actually being exported. And that's an area where we're seeing a lot of old mills being brought back online, some in the Carolinas, some here in New England, some in Texas. Like I think there's incredible growth coordination there, but because of all the labor that goes into the textile sector, it's, very sadly cheaper to produce overseas. So we're still seeing India and Turkey as the hotbeds of organic cotton finished good production in the world. Highly recommend looking at the Textile Exchange does some really good work along with the Organic Cotton Growers Cooperative out of Lubbock. They've done some really good research and white papers on these topics. I think organic hemp does have some potential as a domestic fiber alternative to cotton. Still, hemp processing infrastructure, especially for textiles, is really complicated and not as robustly developed as the infrastructure for cotton. It, of course, once was very well developed in the US, but it's really waned away. So I do think there's potential for hemp. It's a little more limited because of probably limited consumer awareness and uptake, and it's kind of a worse infrastructure situation than we have for cotton. How is it that 95% of US households buy organic, yet it's still a minority of total sales? That I wish I had a good answer to that question. I think, when we see in a lot of these state data sheets, household penetration, where we see, 80 or 90% of households buy some organic, it might be just a few things. Those definitions of what regularly purchases organic means can vary. But for a lot of that 90%, they're buying a few items. And it might be, for reasons other than its organicness. It might just be that the organic produce looks really good or the organic meat looks really good. I think the proportion of households that are consistently and intentionally buying organic very regularly is much smaller than that 95%. And I think that's where we see the biggest opportunity in consumer education is helping people cross categories. Going back to my years as a retailer, that's really tricky. You have people who are buying organic produce and understand its benefit, but not making the leap to personal care products or meat or poultry. And Travis, that's a really good point too. Organic products are way more expensive and lower in supply. And so while the price differences in fresh produce are substantial but relatively minimal compared to the price differences in meat and poultry or other categories, I think budget is an increasingly big factor for a lot of Americans who are having to make tough choices. So I wish that penetration number were bigger or that, it was a bigger part of people's shopping carts, and it is trending positively, but it's a slow road and affordability plays a really big role. What are the practical demands and who are the buyers for the non-feed grains you listed in Texas? So, like we're talking about small grains and oats and things like that. I think a lot of that's going into food processing markets. Some of it, like legumes, I think there's a really good specialty market for dried and packaged beans and lentils that is growing. A lot of production in the Pacific Northwest that continues to expand, showing pretty big consumer demand signals for those crops and commodities. Um, and then a lot going into, food processing, cereals, baked goods, things like that that use, legumes not going into baked goods so much, but oats and things like that going in there. And then, Krista, I want to tackle your thoughtful question now before we get into the buyer feedback. You asked about my thoughts on the conundrum of decreasing acreage of organic with increasing demand. How do we reconcile this? What needs to happen so that we can facilitate new market opportunities to meet this demand for farmers in the US rather than importing? That's one of the most important questions we have to be asking. And I think decreasing organic acreage is a really big problem. A lot of the factors going into that are probably the cost and difficulty of certification. We see people dropping their certifications and just, producing, not necessarily changing their practices, but in some smaller markets and people selling direct to consumer are dropping certifications. I think the cost of land and land access issues, especially in coastal areas, are driving some of that too. And I think that goes back to what we're discussing with Texas. Areas with more affordable and expansive land have a really big role to play in that. We're having similar conversations in these sessions with the Plain States and the Midwest too. Um, and then, the import scenario is really complicated. It involves international trade, economies where it's cheaper to produce products, the increasing role of tariffs in some of these equations and international relationships. I think a lot of that will shake out. But I think that the question you ask, I think, is one of the questions that we are all here asking together. And one of the reasons that the top program exists is really to address a lot of those barriers for transitioning farmers so that they do have the technical support and the economic data to understand that going organic is a good decision and that there's a really stable road ahead. So that was a rambling non-answer, but really good question. All right. I'm going to jump into our buyer piece. And yeah, we're on almost an hour. I'm really impressed with how fast I talked there. I hope I didn't run anyone over, but all right. Here's the final component of our toolkit. Um, the intent here was to paint a picture. We kind of developed the earlier parts of the toolkit, and in working with Rodale, we realized we'd missed an opportunity to really pull together advice and experiences from people buying organic produce to help us answer this set of questions for farmers. So we talked to retailers, both large and small. We talked to some single unit natural food stores. We spoke to some national natural food chains. We spoke with school districts, processors, buyers of grain, and distribution companies, both food hubs and larger distributors, buying and selling organic food to retailers and other buyers. We interviewed 23 buyers of organic products across the US and um, found incredible consistency in what they had to say and their feedback for organic growers. First of all, the part of our team that did these interviews realized early on that the buyers are not a monolithic group. depending on whether they're from a natural food chain or a food co-op or a school district, they're all operating in completely different organizational cultures and under different constraints. And even within retailers, like some buyers are like dyed-in-the-wool organic believers. Some are with conventional chains who have gotten a mandate that they have to buy more organic, but they don't really understand what it is and come from a real conventional mindset. And so we put this slide in really just to remind everyone to understand what kind of buyer you're working with and match your outreach and communication style to the type of person they are and how they want to communicate with farmers. We talked with buyers about where they meet potential suppliers, and conferences, trade shows, and field and farm days play a really big role. A lot of buyers are talking to their existing suppliers about what their neighbors are growing or whether they know anyone with a given crop that they're looking for. They use directories like practicalfarmers.org. They often respond really well. In fact, all of them, none of them don't like getting cold calls and emails from potential growers, especially when they're local and fill a void that they're experiencing. And an increasing number are working with not just big distributors, but food hubs, sometimes nonprofit, sometimes for profit, smaller food distribution entities that are helping aggregate products from small to medium growers and get them to retailers and institutions. We distilled our findings into the 6 C's of today's buyers. Those are communication. The buyers talked a lot about how they like to communicate with growers and suppliers. And one of the big surprises there is they prefer over communication. They do not mind getting multiple phone calls, emails, within reason, of course. And really, especially want to hear from farms as the season is progressing, especially if there's any surprises or bad news. They want to hear it early and directly. Consistency is important. Quality, sizing, what kind of packaging, how does it arrive at the store? All really important that it be consistent and transparently discussed at the outset. Caring, they want to build two-way, mutually beneficial relationships with their growers. Collaboration between growers is really important to them, especially the food hubs and distributors. They love when growers work together to, combine crops, kind of, work through some instability by providing more consistent supply by working together. They all love boots on the ground farm experiences, not only to get to know you and your crop, but to really capture your story and your passion and your authenticity and carry that through to how they sell your products to their consumers, especially in the retail sector. Um, and cost was a big area of feedback that they wanted to talk about. There's a lot of disconnects when they talk to potential growers about cost and retail margin expectations and the fact that retailers cannot offer farmers market prices to growers. I think that's an area where a lot of the buyers we talk to, especially with newer growers, spend some time in discussion and education at the outset. Um, Buyers were really consistent that you cannot over communicate. They love clear communication, prompt responses with an acknowledgement that when you're on the farm, you can't always pick up your phone or call right back. But most of them talked about, really requiring and appreciating when a farm is able to return a phone call within a few hours or have someone who maybe isn't in the field who's liaising with them to share information and answer any questions. They love it when you pick up the phone immediately if something changes. They want to know if there's going to be a yield issue or a quality issue or something unexpected. They'd much prefer to know as early as possible so that they can adapt and work with you on whatever the issue might be. Consistency came up even more than price with a lot of buyers. They want consistent quality. They want, a clear conversation with the grower about what quality means for them and what they're expecting. A predictable supply, which doesn't always mean a year-round supply, but it means transparency about when it starts, when it stops, how we think it's going to look for the year. Um, Clear expectations were really important to them. Again, just being transparent. And a lot of them said, they have better experiences working with growers who um, grow one or two things really well rather than spread themselves thin with a lot of crop diversity. There are exceptions to that, and it all depends on scale and skill and the resources you have. But a lot of them talked about that dynamic being really important. Buyers notice when the farmers see the relationship as a partnership and a two-way street instead of just a transaction. They value farmers who ask questions and want to understand the buyer's constraints, and that's a two-way street. Patience and persistence. Sometimes these relationships are built over a lot of time. For some national bigger retailers, often a year from initial conversation to stuff on the shelf. And really importantly, they want a real story, like not just marketing fluff, but they want your authentic story about what you grow, who you are, why you grow it, and where you grow it. Like, how does your crop fit into your region's sense of place and your local economy? Many buyers emphasized collaboration. That came up a lot for institutional buyers. Like we talked to school lunch directors who fed, I think our largest feeds 28,000 students a day, really want a consistent supply of organic citrus and apples and fruit for snacks. But working with any one grower is really difficult. So food hubs that aggregate supply across a lot of similar growers are really important to colleges, universities, elementary and high school systems that are buying a lot of stuff but need a consistent supply throughout the school year. Um, Similar with the cotton sector, we talked to the Texas Cotton Cooperative people quite a bit. And that's an essential part of how their cooperative works. They provide a framework for farmers to work together and aggregate their supply and share quality specifications. And that allows them to aggregate that and sell to much bigger buyers than any one buyer would have access to working independently. Buyers want to see the farm. Everyone loves going out to the farm, and it's not just to have a fun day in the country, it's to understand your practices. What does farming organically mean on your farm? How does it benefit your soil health, the quality of your crop, and the local environment? And how can they capture that story, that photo of you in your field, that story of how you came to become organic or become a farmer to begin with? Like that authenticity matters so much, especially to retailers who your product might be on a shelf next to a conventional product from across the country. How can they help their shoppers understand that no, it's better for me, my local economy, and the planet to buy this particular product? And your story is really important to that. Cost was the hardest one. And I think a lot of the buyers struggled with this because they're also really empathetic to the economic constraints facing farmers, but they cannot pay full farmers market prices. They cannot pay full retail. They have to make their 30 or 40 or more percent as a retailer, depending on what their structure is. They're under a lot of price pressure from their consumers as well. That said, in some corners of the market, especially in the natural food retail sector, some buyers did say they have flexibility on margin when a product has a really good story, is truly local to a store or a region. They do sometimes have flexibility, but it depends on the buyer you're working with and the category and the holes that they have to fill in their set. Do's and don'ts that we heard. Do give personalized outreach. Definitely send samples and follow up after you send a sample. Don't just assume they're going to call you back, but pop in to the store a few days later or give a quick phone call to see how they liked it. Ask them about gaps. Where do they see gaps in their sets now? And where do they see things going in the future? What are they going to be, and they don't always know what they're going to be worried about next year, but they often have a really good sense of where consumer trends are going and where their supply issues are going to be. Respond as quickly as you can, certainly within 24 hours, and treat conversations with buyers as building a long-term relationship. The ones we talk to really are interested in building longer-term relationships and seeing it as a real two-way street. What to not do? Don't expect farmers market or full retail pricing. Don't chase trends. Love what you grow. And trends are tricky. Like there are things that started out as trends that are now mainstays in the industry. But be careful and talk to your buyers. They usually have a really nuanced sense of whether something's a short-lived fad or a more durable trend line in the market. Don't hide bad news. Let them know as soon as you know anything that's going to affect their supply or your relationship. Don't grow what's saturated in your region unless there's an insane demand for it. But to figure that out, again, it's really good to talk to your neighbors, your buyers, your distributors to ask them where are they seeing saturation and where are they seeing white space and opportunity. And don't presume transportation expectations. Be real clear. Ask them how they expect your stuff to get to their store, in what condition, in what type of vehicle, during what hours, and at what temperature. All that stuff. By category, in the natural food retail sector, they really value local sourcing. Both, we talked to some regional retailers and to Whole Foods. They all still value local sourcing. Samples matter to them. They want to taste and share what you're providing with other folks in their office to kind of get everyone's reaction. They prefer experienced growers, and that doesn't mean they don't work with inexperienced or new growers. It just means that they've had some experiences where a new grower doesn't understand what they're getting into and they run into supply issues. So if you are new to what you're doing, just show the buyer that you have the aptitude, you've asked the hard questions, and you're getting good technical assistance and support from folks who are really experienced. Um, the natural product retail buyers we talked to cited huge gaps in organic floral, which I know there's a lot of organic flower production in Texas and the West. Heirloom apples, again, not necessarily a supply issue so much as a transportation and storage issue, getting consistent heirloom apples throughout the year. Really durable demand for culinary mushrooms around the country, really interesting artisanal culinary varieties of mushrooms and culturally relevant produce. Produce that is situated in the ethnic and cultural traditions of a given region is really important. And a lot of buyers have trouble finding those more obscure things where there's a lot of local demand in an organic form. Wholesale buyers, similarly, they emphasize pricing. They too take a cut of the final retail price, and it's really important to work with a wholesale buyer to understand their margin structure and pricing expectations. They too love to work with growers who grow fewer things rather than spread thin on a lot of different little things with smaller supply per item. They also talked about saturation. I think it's heartbreaking for a lot of them to have a grower come to them who's growing something that they are already in too much of and have too many options for. Cooperation with nearby farms. If a food hub is sending out a truck, they love to fill it up. And if there's an opportunity to work with your neighbors and people growing similar crops to aggregate your supply, definitely a positive for a lot of distributors that we talk to, especially in the natural and organic space. School districts operate very differently from retailers. They have formal bid processes because they're part of governmental entities. They have longer planning horizons for that and other reasons. They increasingly rely on smaller distributors and food hubs to get consistent supply of key ingredients throughout the school year. A lot of districts we spoke to, especially in California, Colorado, throughout the West, are going back to scratch cooking. And some of them are really mission aligned focus on sourcing locally and organically. They do definitely have as much cost sensitivity as any other buyer. But in districts where there is an intentional focus on sustainable and organic sourcing, there's a little flexibility on that cost. And among all of them, schools are some of the most reliable payers of your invoices. With grain buyers, both with human feed and animal feed, they work very differently than other sectors. Most of the processors work on multi-year contracts. Because of the demands of their buyers, there's much more mandatory sampling and testing that goes into selling grain, more quality assurance requirements, longer planning cycles than with retailers. And because of these long contracts and really complex requirements, they truly value longer term, multi year relationships. Grain buyers we talked to express difficulty sourcing organic field peas, lentils, milo, feed grain corn and soy, and high oleic soy for oil processing. In the seed sector, here it is. Um, Being a seed farmer is very different from being a vegetable farmer. There's federal rules around seed purity. There are legal requirements. There's issues with weed and seed needing to be controlled. And yet a lot of supply gaps in seed production. Cover crop seeds like radishes, oats, rye, peas But the advice there is really if you're getting into seed production, work with a regional or local seed organization or a really competent seed grower. The requirements are really complex and the stakes are really high. So we just want to make sure folks getting into that sector have the right technical assistance and support. And then with fiber, the challenges are huge. The variability in weather is really affecting yields and quality in the areas where we grow organic cotton. And there's not a lot of domestic manufacturing infrastructure. That said, the organic cotton sector is growing. It's just up against some constraints. So I think it's really important to work with a cooperative or with a knowledgeable buyer to, make sure you're aligning with where the potential economic value is for the sector. A couple of final insights on, not black clouds, but gray clouds. That picture's a little darker. I probably should have picked a lighter one, but organic is growing at 5.5%. It's a $72 billion industry. There are some issues on the horizon. Number one is misinformation. Not with every buyer we talk to, but with some of the institutional buyers who are newer to organic, conventional retailers, they need to be reminded what the benefits of organic are, the basics, that toxic and persistent pesticides and agriculturals aren't allowed, that growers have to use practices that support soil health and constitute what we might call regenerative practices. The rise of the term regenerative has led to a lot of confusion in the marketplace. And while there are programs like ROC, Regenerative Organic Certified, which requires USDA organic as its foundation, there are other certifications out there that allow synthetic inputs, and there's no legal definition of regenerative. So I can slap the word on anything I grow in any particular way. And so that's really tricky. I think there's an opportunity in talking to buyers and the public in helping them understand what organic really requires, not just the chemicals that aren't used, but the soil health building practices like cover cropping that the use of compost, like things that actually do regenerate soil and do create stability and positive environmental impact. A lot of buyers didn't really understand all of that, and that'll always be an issue, but big educational opportunities as we're working with people who are less familiar with organic benefits. And then price sensitivity. Fiber and meat are really good examples. We have international supply chains. We have, with meat, the cost of feed is amplified and the cost of the finished animal product. That pricing volatility still is an issue, and it's something to definitely be aware of and thoughtful about going into those sectors. That said, these conversations were generally really positive, especially I wasn't as familiar with school districts and their sourcing policies evolving. But they're a huge opportunity, and especially in states where there's a commitment to sourcing locally, sustainably, and scratch cooking. Um, Nutrient density came up. I think there's a growing awareness from some buyers, especially in natural and organic channels, that food that we grow in healthy soil is healthier for us and has higher levels of certain phytonutrients and animal products, better omega-3 ratios. I think we're a long way from making like label claims about those attributes, but there's definitely a growing awareness among consumers and retail buyers that organic is more nutrient dense. Um, and then the repeated mantra. I just loved hearing multiple buyers say that in different ways that they love to work with growers who love what they grow, who have that story that exudes passion and authenticity and really helps them understand and convey to their retail buyers what makes your crop unique and special and better for the planet and better for the region that they're buying in. So to land the plane here, what we heard from buyers is they definitely want more organic, but within a lot of real constraints. They want to work with farmers that are experienced or show that they, know what questions to ask and will have a good, consistent supply. They love talking to farmers. They love building relationships. And they definitely have some learning to do on what the benefits are, but they really appreciate the information. Whew. That that is the end of our buyer section. I had planned on a full hour and a half. I don't know how I got it done in that period of time, but here we are. let me know any more questions you have in the chat. I appreciate the conversation about affordability. It's such a big and complex set of issues, and getting the scale that we need to make organic even more accessible and affordable is a giant problem to solve, that's bigger than any one of us, but I'm hopeful. Someone asked early on, I don't know if I answered this, will the slides be available? Yes, on organictransition.org and the Rodale Institute's resource page. I would also encourage anyone with additional questions or feedback to reach out to markets@rodaleinstitute.org. I'm going to pop that in the chat, unless Bridget, you're doing it already. Got it. Oh, jinx. All right. Well, that email address you see twice before you is the best place to reach out with questions, with feedback, with ideas for resources for future iterations of this program. We are really interested in evolving it, refining it, making it a little more focused and granular, like a little more information for big areas like California. Like, how can we get a little more granular? So let us know what you think. Give us your feedback, ask any questions you have. And I can't thank you all enough for taking over an hour out of a really busy day during a really busy time of year to have this conversation. So, seeing no more questions, we will end it here, but definitely check out those websites for the materials, and be in touch if we can help you in any way. Thank you all.